Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The Red Cross has slammed the politicization of aid being given to Venezuela. Now, as the humanitarian crisis intensifies in the Latin American country, alongside many other places in the world, it is important to question whether politics should be separated from humanitarian funding. This, of course, becomes an even more pressing issue as the United Nations predicts by 2020, 1 in 45 people will need humanitarian assistance. So how should global leaders and countries at large deal with the issue of aid? We discuss this topic on today's show. Joining us for this session is Amir Richani, who's a geopolitical analyst who focuses on Latin America. He joins us from Valencia in Venezuela. Also joining us today is Dr. Mark Meirowitz, who's a professor at State University of New York Maritime College and is a political analyst. He joins us from New York. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Richani, let me begin with you. Now, 2019 is almost ending and it has been a very turbulent year for Venezuela. How do you see things moving forward, the socio-political situation in the country?
Thank you, Michelle, first of all, for having me in the show. Well, the situation is very critical in Venezuela. It has been worsening over the last few years, and it doesn't seem very bright coming forward. And the reason why is because the economy of Venezuela has been precarious, it has been catastrophic, and this has only worsened the social situation in the country. So there is more hunger, there is more malnourishment, and humanitarian organizations are trying to deal with that. The problem over here is that inflation rate has been eradicating, let's say, the purchase power of salaries. It has been worsening the access to food, and it has led us to a bigger problem right now, which is the increasing migration problem of Venezuelans, which is one of the main reasons for the humanitarian aid problem. And what we're having is that, according to the United Nations, between 4 to 4.5 million Venezuelans have left the country over the last few years. But I believe this is more of a conservative number because as every day that passes, we are seeing more Venezuelans leave to neighboring states. It's the interesting thing right here, or the negative thing actually right here, is that what we're having is a bigger gap between the middle classes and the lower classes. And it is the lower class that is paying the price for the economic catastrophe that Venezuela is going through.
Right. Now, Mr. Richani, you've given us a list of things that are going wrong in Venezuela right now, that are eroding the economy, that are eroding the social fabric at large. In all of this, how much do the Venezuelan people rely on humanitarian aid?
So it's a very interesting question, because I believe that the humanitarian situation in Venezuela was something that was rushed due to the current status of the country. So when we had that humanitarian aid coming into Venezuela earlier this year, was because of the effects of a political and social crisis that has been going on in Venezuela over the last few years. So what we're having is we're having problems with humanitarian aid when it comes to the areas that are receiving the aid, because it's not received in all the areas where it's needed. Maybe we have more focal points in the bigger cities. The second would be the accountability of this aid, because there are not lots of checks and balances. And the third one is the politicization, as we have been discussing, because once the humanitarian aid comes into Venezuela, then the question of the state, the role of the state in addressing the humanitarian needs of the people is put in question.
Right. Mr. Richani, you made a number of important points, and I want to get to those. But before that, I'm going to jump to Dr. Meirowitz and talk to him about this. Now, Red Cross has slammed the politicization of this aid, but the central question is something like what is happening in Venezuela. Is it possible for aid and funding to be separated from the politics of it all?
The problem in Venezuela is the leadership in Venezuela. Venezuela has a leader who does not allow humanitarian aid to come into the country. And our senators, including Senator Rubio and others, have protested this. President Trump has placed sanctions. You actually have a country with two presidents, Mr. Maduro, Mr. Guaido. without going into elaborating into the political chaos, which the other gentleman pointed out, this is a travesty and a catastrophe. It's due 100% to the leadership in the country, which is Mr. Maduro. I'm an American. I speak freely, and we have the right to do that. And we are looking at it from the American point of view. And that's what we see here. And we are very, very sad to see the situation, particularly the migration out of millions of Venezuelans and the suffering of the people in Venezuela, which could be alleviated. Can you imagine that trucks and aid were sitting on the border in Colombia and that the Maduro regime would not allow that aid in? It's just extraordinary. Right. I don't know what else is to say about it. In about 2 minutes, this could be alleviated and fixed, and these poor people could be helped. And even President Trump has been trying to help them, but they don't want to allow it in. So if they're not allowing it in, Red Cross or no Red Cross, there's no way to...
Dr. Meirowitz, that is a point that Mr. Richani also talked about here, the internal accountability, the lack of it, and how that disrupts the flow of aid. But before I get to that, I do want to talk about the sanctions that are also placed on Venezuela. And for that, I do want to refer to something that was written by Nicholas Kristof, who's an American journalist and a political commentator. He wrote in an op-ed in the New York Times, and I'm just going to read out the title of this article. Venezuela's kids are dying. Are we responsible? Our well-meaning sanctions may be inflicting pain on the wrong people. Now, trying to take a human angle to all of this, what is your reaction to this title?
I respect Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times. He has a great point, but he's not right because it's a catch-22 situation. I mean, what is the United States supposed to do? The regime, and the same issue with Iranian sanctions, Venezuelan sanctions, these regimes are actually pushing back and not permitting the people to get the aid because they're forcing the people to suffer so the regime can stay in power. I mean, again, I'm speaking as an American. This is how we see it here. And so I don't think that's right. But I think Kristof is making a point, but if the United States doesn't place pressure on the regime isn't going to do anything. These regimes want to self-perpetuate themselves, and they're going to continue to self-perpetuate themselves, notwithstanding the fact that the people are suffering. So you're absolutely right. It should be people-centric. So I think Trump's point, I think Trump has been on the right side of this issue by emphasizing humanitarian aid, and not emphasizing regime change, but just trying to help the people by sending aid over the border. And I think that, to me, is the be-all and end-all of the issue.
Right.
I don't think it's more let the aid in.
Right. Doctor, I want to jump to Mr. Richani and get his point of view on this discussion we're having. Mr. Richani, what are your thoughts on all of this?
I think we must highlight that the crisis in Venezuela has been going on for years, right? So U.S. sanctions were imposed, they have been imposed over the last few years, but the strongest sanctions were imposed in January, which were the oil sanctions. Now, the humanitarian crisis was there for a longer time, so we cannot say that because of those sanctions we have a humanitarian aid in Venezuela. What we must keep in mind, however, is that how long are the sanctions going to remain in place, right? Because Venezuela's Venezuela's main export is oil, which has been sanctioned because of the reasons that Dr. Mark has highlighted. But the question will be, what will be the effects over the long run of these sanctions? So aid has been trying to come into the country, as Dr. Mark has highlighted, and there is a problem of, let's say, governability within the country. So even if the aid is coming, is this aid being received by the right people? So for me, it's more than a question on sanctions. It would be a question of how long will they be in place, and if they are in place for a long time, how are we able in Venezuela to use that aid for the right purposes, which is the exact point that Dr. Mark has highlighted.
Right. And Mr. Richani, elaborate on that point you're making, that the aid that does come in doesn't go in the right hands, that there isn't enough internal accountability.
There was a report written by the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator Mark Lowcock, who said that the aid is politicized pretty much. And that hampers aid in several, let's say, parts. Because on the one hand, it damages the reputation of the organizations that are distributing the aid in Venezuela. That's the first thing. Second would be that it would make donors reluctant to keep donating money to an aid that is supposed to be impartial, but it's being politicized. And the third thing would be that, actually four. The third thing would be pretty much that you are advertising with an aid that should be impartial, a government. And fourth would be the creation of a long-term dependency of this aid, which would, and here is where I come in to comment on the role of the state within the country. So if we have humanitarian aid coming to the country, does this mean that we remove the role of the state in solving the humanitarian situation that we have? And over the long run, that would be the result. We need to remember that Venezuela was at least a rich country. It's just bad government that has led us to the current situation. So lack of accountability, dependence, and politicization are the problems that are dominating the distribution of aid within the country.
Right, but it seems like the situation right now is in a complete deadlock.
Yes, it's a political deadlock. I completely agree. The opposition has lost a bit of momentum, and there are currently some corruption scandals that are further weakening, let's say, the cohesion of the opposition. On the other hand, you have Nicolás Maduro's government, who has been reluctant of ceding power. And it doesn't seem a situation that will be solved in the near time, at least. Maybe a few months ago, the situation was different. There were negotiations and dialogue between the government and the opposition. But today, the situation has completely changed. And yesterday, there was a meeting of states against Nicolás Maduro. But it seems that the reaction of the international community has slowed down. And I think in big part because of the problems that we're seeing in Latin America, the wave of protests, arrests. And it seems that Venezuela has been taken into a has become secondary to the region, because you're having all these problems in Latin America.
Right. Mr. Meirowitz, just to open up the discussion a little more. Now, I want to go back to the point that I was making, and that was specifically in terms of Venezuela, but I do want to make it in larger context. We do see humanitarian crisis, whether it's displacement because of climate change or conflict and violence across the world. They're intensifying, they're increasing, and predictions show that they will continue to increase. In all of this, do you think that humanitarian aid can be and should be given on the basis of politics and what domestic foreign goals are?
Well, first of all, I wanted to step back a moment to Mr. Richani's excellent points. I mean, the political situation is not only internal, it's also the external intervention of various countries in Venezuela, number one. Number two, the sad part is that, as Mr. Richani pointed out, this is an oil-rich country which has dissipated all of this valuable assets in this political quagmire and the disaster and a political situation that, to me, the solution, I guess, has to be some sort of a commission or group that gets together to try to fix this and build a Venezuela future, or the catastrophe for the people is going to be unending. So on that point. Now, on the point that you raised about foreign aid, let's be realistic. Foreign aid, I think the United States, is the biggest giver of foreign aid in the world. And it's true that historically, foreign aid has had some political connotations in terms of soft power and giving foreign aid to countries. But at the end of the day, I think that if you look at the balance sheet in terms of the foreign aid, in terms of American foreign aid, I think this has been a saving grace in the world and has been helpful to millions of people in the world. And I think that's the bottom line. So rather than focusing on some political, benefits that might inure to the benefit of the United States, Russia, China, whatever, I think the idea is helping the people. And that's where the failure of international organizations is really very, very, very big issue. This is an international issue, as you said. International community has got to solve it. It shouldn't be done on an ad hoc basis by one country at a time. So I think that to make a bigger issue, the bigger issue is a very big issue. I don't see how it gets solved. And again, I think what you said before in Venezuela is the poster child for this. Politics is getting in the way of the people. It gets in the way everywhere, and it's really a problem. And sovereignty, because these countries, these leaders who are sovereign leaders will not allow their regimes to be interfered with, even if it hurts the people. Right. So it's kind of a difficult situation. I don't know how to solve it. I think we need something to change in Venezuela, and really soon, so it can get back to where it was.
Right. Mr. Richani, now on this, and we're talking about the broader picture here, the global picture of giving aid and also the intervention or the assistance of more developed nations, there also seems to be a very imbalanced narrative that goes out there. I mean, reports and documents show that it is the developing nations which host 80% of the refugees in the world. They are the ones that have to shoulder the burden, and yet we're seeing the demonization of these refugees largely being done in European and Western spheres due to the politics. What correction do you feel like there needs to be in the narrative that's put out there?
Thank you, Meshal. So let me pull it back to Venezuela. So you're talking about European states, but I think the same applies to Venezuela in this case. First, when you're talking about the host countries, I think it's easier to send humanitarian aid to those countries than receiving the refugees. And this is one of the reasons why we see developed countries sending aid to developing countries that are hosting these communities. And this is the case, for example, in Colombia. We're seeing that. So there is aid coming into Colombia to help the Venezuelan migrant crisis, although this help is not enough. But so that's the first point. It's easier for developed countries to keep those refugees, as terrible as this sounds, in developing countries. It might be related to the proximity.
But that's the point there. That's the point there. Are these developed nations doing enough to even shoulder the burden? I mean, we're seeing the case in Bangladesh. Bangladesh keeps on saying that not enough is being done for the Rohingya refugees that it has to host. This is happening all across the world. So it might be easier for them not to take in refugees, but are they even shouldering the burden of the humanitarian crisis we're seeing unfold on a global scale? So
let's start with. So let me bring this back to politicization, because I think this is the main topic. So here we're talking about two things. Either first you host those refugees, or you give funding for those refugees, right? So it's way easier to send the funding in this case. So if we're discussing, is it easier for the United States to bring in Rohingya refugees? I think it's easier for them to send the money and have them in Bangladesh. And the second thing, I think there is a structural problem when we're talking about refugees that go to neighboring countries. No matter how hard you try, these refugees are going to find a way to cross, because they are running from a terrible either armed conflict or economic crisis. So it's harder for neighboring countries to reject the entry of refugees. And we can see that in examples like with the case of Syria, where in Lebanon you had, I don't want to say numbers, but you had many people just crossing and going into Lebanon, although Lebanon opened the borders for refugees. These refugees also travel to other countries despite not having the let's say, the facility from the neighboring countries. Right. So it's very hard structurally to block them from entering.
Right. Mr. Meirowitz, now we are talking about humanitarian crisis, and the migration crisis, the refugee crisis is one of the most pressing issues of our times. From the United States perspective, we saw a crisis at the southern border. We saw Trump's rhetoric. We saw the criticism of it. How do you feel like that has changed? Do you feel like there is a growing cognizance in the country that more needs to be done for refugees and migrants?
Well, I mean, before I go to the United States, I wanted to pick up on Mr. Richani's point about Syria, which I think was a very important point. And in terms of Turkey, which has taken in, which is my area of expertise, which has taken in about 3.6 million refugees, we see clearly that this problem is not, is a matter, again, of sovereignty, because the countries that are taking the refugees have to deal with the refugees and have to, as Turkey has done, give them education, health care. And then what happens in the long run to those refugees? I mean, at the present time, Turkey is trying to figure out a way to send them back to Syria. But once they get into these countries, it becomes a national crisis. And I think that you see that in the United States as well. It relates also to Mr. Richani's point about politicization. I think in terms of the United States, the immigration issue has been highly and harshly politicized, and particularly by President Trump. And I think to me that's very, very problematic. You know, the United States is a nation of immigrants. On our Statue of Liberty, we have a poem called "Give Me Your Tired, Your Poor." And it's always been, I'm a child of immigrants. So that's been our tradition in this country. And I think it should still be our tradition. But it becomes politicized. And then we see that around the globe. And when that becomes politicized, the ones that get hurt are the refugees and get harmed are the refugees. And they're the last consideration. So again, it's kind of a people issue, which is interfered with by state sovereignty. And all the things we talked about today, state sovereignty, politicization, all interfere. And then that also interferes with the United Nations and the international institutions, which you're picturing on your screen. The UN institutions have difficulty doing what they need to do because the states involved are not facilitating and permitting the help to come in and the issues to be resolved. And I would say as a last point, in some cases, having a refugee crisis and having a refugee issue is a political issue, and that maybe that's just something that's been done to, you know, to heat up the situation and make it more complicated. It's very unfortunate because, again, the people are suffering, and that is the problem. So I think there would be a way to refocus it. In terms of the United States, that's an issue in the elections. We'll see how the elections turn out, and we'll see whether the immigration issue did resonate or not.
Right. And Mr. Meirowitz, you've emphasized that point that there is a need to refocus on this. But we have seen from past dialogues between countries, we've seen from summits that it seems like this just remains in the domain of talk and no strict action is taken. Do you see anything changing in the near future?
I would say I'm not going to be optimistic, and I'll tell you why. If you look around the world today, and particularly in the United States as a major power in the world, the Trump doctrine, which is all about nationalism and making America great, and every country should pursue their nationalism. When you say that, what you're really saying is my country first, my issues first, and you know the rest of the world isn't important. And that, I think, is really a problem because even in American foreign policy, I don't think that's ever been the view of American foreign policy. I think America has been there in earthquakes, disasters, humanitarian aid. And other countries, I think, are following this mantra or this idea about my country first. When you do my country first, then who suffers? People suffer. You don't want to give humanitarian aid because that costs money and you're not spending money internally. You see, it's all about the focus internally. So I think that I'm not going to be optimistic. If this is the tenor of politics around the world today, then I think that there's going to be, unfortunately, a lot more suffering. And again, and I keep emphasizing sovereignty. Look, Trump is the biggest emphasizer of state sovereignty. He says, America first, make America great. Right. And what he's basically saying is, it's my border, and anybody who doesn't want us to come in shouldn't come in. And as I said before, we're a nation of immigrants, and we shouldn't be doing that. But if that idea spreads around the world, then you won't have sufficient support for those. But it seems
like that idea has spread across the world. It seems like that idea is being fostered across the world. Mr. Richani, now nationalism, this need for putting the country first isn't just America's problem alone. We're seeing it all across the world. How do you think that will impact the human at the center of the story?
Well, I have to agree with Dr. Mark because we're seeing that today in Latin America, as I mentioned before, with all the let's say social, political, and economic crisis that Latin America is going through, the migrant crisis of Venezuelans across the region have taken has taken a step aside in this case. And with more nationalism, we only emphasize xenophobic acts. We only emphasize hate to the migrant. And just like Dr. Mark said, Venezuela was also a land of migrants. And today we're seeing that Venezuelans are being rejected across Latin America and across the world. So we're shifting back into that nationalistic view that is only hurting. Let's say it's only putting stronger walls between our borders and hampering the whole putting obstacles in the humanitarian aspects of the crisis that we're seeing across the region and maybe across the world. Yeah.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Amir Richani, for joining us from Valencia, Venezuela, and Dr. Mark Meirowitz from joining us from New York. Now, TikTok has been found for implementing quite a controversial policy and attempts to reduce cyberbullying on its platform. After the break, we discuss what this policy is. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, TikTok has been found to limit the reach of its users who have disabilities. The social network's explanation, they were trying to reduce cyberbullying on their platform. Let's take a closer look at what is happening on TikTok and what this move meant for cyberbullying and what can be done in the future to limit cyberbullying. Joining us for this discussion today is Adam Smith, who's a social media expert. He joins us from London. Thank you so much, Adam, for joining us, and welcome to the show. Now, Adam, this was, of course, a previous policy put in place by TikTok, but it is creating quite a lot of controversy. What do we know so far about these guidelines?
So what we know is that TikTok put this policy in place to protect users with a high risk of bullying. These are LGBT people, people that are maybe larger people, and people with disabilities. Now, what TikTok did is that they stopped videos made by those kind of people from appearing in the algorithm. So there was a setting called Auto R, which stopped videos from hitting other users, For You feeds after hitting a certain view count, and essentially limited those videos from getting a lot of attention in order to stop bullying. Now, the reason that's caused controversy is because many people see this as TikTok essentially blaming the victims of cyberbullying by limiting their own spread rather than taking action against those actually doing the bullying. And this is where the controversy comes from.
Right, Adam, and you rightly highlighted why this is so controversial. But another thing that comes to mind is whether this move was actually an earnest effort to stop cyberbullying, or was there anything more to it? I mean, there's a lot of controversy surrounding the social media platform at large. I mean, every other day we hear another news story coming out. So do you feel like there could be anything more to the story?
Well, TikTok has previously faced issues of political censorship. It has limited videos that would offend the Chinese government, and recently suspended a user who criticized China's imprisonment policies, although that user is now back up. I actually do not think that this particular instance is related to any form of greater political censorship. I think this is simply a case of something that we've seen numerous times, of companies getting too big, not having the correct policies put in place, going for what TikTok has said it was a blunt and temporary solution to the problem, but more importantly, not consulting with, it seems, the people that were suffering from cyberbullying, so not talking to disabled people or LGBT people, and more importantly, not informing these users either of the policies that's going about. I don't believe that this isn't necessarily a political thing, but it paints it's another part of a wider issue of large companies not engaging with the users and not being transparent about the activities that they're doing.
Right. Now, Adam, that is true. This is, of course, a pattern that we've been witnessing over and over again. These social media platforms, companies coming up with policies and guidelines which are reflecting disengagement with the end user. But the question here is now, even TikTok has 1 billion users worldwide. How is it possible for a firm like this, such a large firm, along with all the other large tech firms, to actually engage in a meaningful way and come up with policies that actually suit everyone? I mean, this would be something that they would throw back at their critics.
I think that's a very good question. I think it's difficult certainly to engage with every single user, and certainly many social media companies have been criticized for a whole range of reasons on that front. I think it again comes down to transparency and comes down to talking to a much greater range of people, a much greater range of users on these platforms in order to create policies that work. As we've seen here, TikTok was not ready for perhaps its rapid rise in users. 1.5 billion is a lot of people. For contrast, Facebook, which has been around for a good many years longer, has about 2 billion users. And I think without social media companies preparing for this rise and preparing to speak with possibly the most vulnerable people on its platform, the people that are going to attract hatred and attract bullying, without doing that, there's no way these companies can provide adequate moderation in any forms, whether that's by artificial intelligence or by human moderation. They simply go to groups of users that may be affected and ask them what they think the best policy are, and then tell everyone what they're doing. That is the only way that we can move forward. Right.
And just to put in context how large of a problem cyberbullying is. Now, the United Nations carried out a poll which spanned over 30 countries, and it found that almost 1 in every 3 people, and these are young people we're talking about, faced online cyberbullying and harassment. Now, these figures are alarming, and these repercussions were also just as alarming. This prevented children from wanting to go to school. This, of course, prevented them from wanting to engage with other social media users, also led to a number of mental health issues. Now, when we're talking about this, social media companies also realize the massiveness of this issue and problem. Adam, do you see any policies working in the social media realm that are successfully targeting cyberbullying?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't think any of the policies are really doing enough. And because simply, if they were, I don't think we would be facing these issues. I think this is also a symptom of a greater issue that has so many children linking both their identity and, to a later extent in life, businesses and their own personal brand with social media, with the digitization of the self, essentially meaning that you need to have a good online presence. You need to be online in order to get anywhere in life. With regards to content policies, much more needs to be done in order to ensure that children who can surely be affected by these things the most harshly have a safer experience online. I honestly don't think that there are many policies in place, certainly not off the top of my head, that I would point to and say this is a successful means of doing this.
Right, and if you can't really point out to one policy that stands out, that does show that no platform is really doing it in the right manner. Now, on that point that you mentioned, that all these young children are trying to create their brand online, they, of course, are trying to explore themselves online, trying to see what works for them, what doesn't, and we know how social media works in this regard. One central question is whether content moderation should be different for different age groups, especially when we're talking about younger people. Adam, do you feel like that is something social media companies need to seriously take on?
Well, it's certainly an interesting idea, and there are good arguments on both sides. However, I would say that in order for a social media company to adequately do that, it would need to gather more information about the age of social media users and be able to enact those policies effectively based on that data. Now, as we know, for example, with large social networks like Twitter, occasionally with Facebook, certainly with YouTube, a lot of people aren't willing to give that data away, even for safety, because it can be used for malicious purposes. I personally think that a good policy for one person should be a good policy for all people. We should all be trying to behave to the best of our ability, whether those are young people online or whether those are old people that admittedly should know better. I think it would be much more helpful to make blanket content policies that can be understood by everyone than it is trying to mediate policies based on the age and maturity, let's say, of particular users. I think down that path, it's death.
I take your point there. That's an important point that you're making, that people should just be more civilized online. Unfortunately, that is the ideal situation, one that we all aspire towards, but something that we're just not seeing happening for a number of reasons. Now, Adam, in all of this, how do you feel like the user must take on responsibility or must be cautious? I mean, I'm not trying to victim blame the user, but when you're seeing so many cases out there, what measures can the user take to protect themselves, and what policies and legislations need to be in place to protect the user?
I think the policy that any user should take to protect themselves is a policy that's for a while. It's do not say anything online that you would not be happy saying face to face, essentially. I think that is the best way of actually looking into it, because so much of our lives in the real world have been influenced and developed by our lives online. These two things, it does not make sense anymore to separate them. It is not. I do not think it is meaningful in the same way to separate them. In terms of government policies, I go back to the point that I made previously. It simply comes down to transparency. I am not a legal expert, as it were. I don't know what the best way for the law to affect these companies would be, but more than anything else, being transparent with your users, as TikTok was not in this instance, as many companies have not been in the past, is an imperative, because without that information, there is no way that we can actually put this legislation in place. There is no way that ordinary everyday users can actually have conversations with this, and
And Adam, you have reiterated constantly that greater transparency is necessary, and I agree with you on that. But before I let you go, just one last question. Why do you think these big firms resist transparency? What do they have to lose?
The reason big firms resist transparency, and the reason big firms find it so difficult with content moderation, is because, in my mind, of responsibility. The more any platform that appears on it, the more it is likely to get sued, is likely to face legal ramifications for hosting that content. If Facebook or Twitter or TikTok on these platforms that we own and make money, then simply the better a legal defense they have. It is a protection ultimately of profits and capital, but it is not one that is beneficial for the users.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Adam Smith, for joining us from London. And thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again next time with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.